Muy buenos días, tengan todas y todos ustedes. Les damos la más cordial bienvenida en nombre del Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua, del IMTA, y de la Cátedra UNESCO IMTA, el agua en la sociedad del conocimiento, a todas y todos ustedes, en un espacio más del conocimiento en línea, como todos los viernes, este espacio tradicional que ya ha venido conformando esta comunidad de conocimiento entre todos nosotros para poder analizar y conversar sobre los temas más importantes y los avances de conocimiento más importantes en torno al agua en México y en todo el mundo, como es el caso de la charla que tendremos esta mañana en México, esta tarde en Mánchester, desde donde nos acompaña nuestro conferencista de esta mañana, Timothy Foster, a quien presentaremos en un instante más. Yo quiero darle la más cordial bienvenida a todas las personas que se encuentran con nosotros en esta plataforma de Zoom y también a todos los que se encuentran con nosotros ya reunidos también a través de redes sociales, a través de Facebook Live, a través de Twitter y a través de las páginas institucionales del Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua que ya tenemos pues, en pantalla. Mi nombre es Marco Sánchez y de verdad que me es un honor y es un gusto poder dar la bienvenida y saludarles a todas y a todos ahí hasta donde se encuentren y pues muy contento de que hayan decidido destinar este espacio de su día para estar en el mejor lugar posible para conocer directamente con Timothy Foster sobre el acceso al riego sostenible para pequeños agricultores y las experiencias y los avances de conocimiento que nos compartirá esta mañana. Yo quiero comentarles que esta sesión está siendo grabada, de forma que si hay alguna parte de la información que te resulte particularmente importante para estarla repasando, pues este material va a estar disponible en un momento más cuando termine el seminario en la plataforma de YouTube, en el canal YouTube del Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua y por supuesto también estará disponible para todas y todos en redes sociales. La dinámica que tendremos esta mañana, que es una charla que tendremos en inglés, será, ustedes habrán notado, quienes están en la plataforma Zoom, que los micrófonos están bloqueados y así van a permanecer a lo largo de toda la sesión para favorecer pues una experiencia fluida de la charla y del conocimiento y del diálogo que podamos tener con nuestro conferencista de esta mañana. Y la forma de interactuar, que es una parte muy importante de estos espacios, será a través del chat. A través del chat por escrito, en cualquier momento de la charla ustedes pueden plantear sus preguntas, sus comentarios, puede ser en inglés o en español, es indistinto como ustedes lo prefieran, y nosotros estaremos registrando estas preguntas y comentarios para que al final de la charla del doctor Timothy Foster, pues podamos plantearle estas preguntas y comentarios y abrir este diálogo con todas y todos ustedes. Yo quiero en este momento presentarles y dar la bienvenida a el doctor Agustín Breña Naranjo. Él es el coordinador de hidrología del Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua, quien es artífice y quien promovió que pudiéramos tener la fortuna de contar con la presencia del doctor Timothy Foster esta mañana, un reconocido investigador a nivel internacional, y será el doctor Breña quien nos haga favor de presentar una breve semblanza y de introducir el tema que tendremos esta mañana. Que disfruten muchísimo su espacio de conocimiento y yo dejo en el uso del micrófono y de la cámara al doctor Agustín Breña Naranjo. Agustín, ¿cómo estás? Muy, muy buenos días. Te saludo con muchísimo gusto.
Hola, muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Muchas gracias, Marco. Bueno, pues el día de hoy estamos regresando nuevamente al tema de agua y agricultura. Y pues en esta ocasión tenemos al doctor Timothy Foster, de la Universidad de Mánchester en el Reino Unido, quien nos hablará de cómo incrementar la productividad agrícola en sistemas de riego, pero a pequeña escala. Bueno, él nos hablará un poco, ¿no?, de su experiencia de él y de su grupo de investigación que ha estudiado, ¿no?, ampliamente este tipo de agricultura a pequeña escala en diversas partes del mundo, notablemente en África y en Asia. A continuación leeré la semblanza del doctor Foster. Él es profesor titular de Seguridad Hídrica y Alimentaria en la Escuela de Ingeniería de la Universidad de Mánchester, en el Reino Unido. Su investigación combina conocimientos de hidrología, agronomía, economía y teledetección o percepción remota para desarrollar soluciones basadas en datos para la gestión sostenible del uso de la tierra, el agua y la energía en los sistemas de producción agrícola a nivel mundial. Actualmente, su grupo se centra en identificar tecnologías y vías de inversión para ampliar e intensificar el acceso al riego en sistemas agrícolas de pequeña escala en Asia Meridional y en África subsahariana, con el objetivo de mejorar o de lograr la seguridad alimentaria, la reducción de la pobreza y el desarrollo económico en estas regiones. Paralelamente también trabaja activamente en políticas de gestión del agua agrícola en sistemas de alta productividad, tanto en América del Norte y principalmente en Estados Unidos y también en Europa, con un enfoque específico en la evaluación y el diseño de instrumentos de política para incentivar el uso sostenible del agua y permitir la adaptación al cambio climático. Bueno, pues muchas gracias, Tim. Thank you, Tim, for accepting giving this webinar, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agustin and Marco, for the introduction and for the invitation to present today. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully, everyone can see this now. So, buenos dias a todos. Marco and Agustin have, I guess, tested my sort of how much of my Spanish skills I remember from my time at school 15 or so years ago. So I won't go any further in trying to introduce myself in Spanish. So hopefully everyone is fine with presentation in English. So I'm going to be talking today about irrigation development in Sub-Saharan Africa and in smallholder farming systems in general, and the question of whether large or small scale approaches to irrigation development are the best way to achieve food and water security in these particular contexts. So just a bit of background to sort of the work that I do and that my research group and collaborators at the University of Manchester do in this area of water and food security. So our work is broadly focused on trying to understand and design solutions and target solutions that can be used to sustain agricultural water management. So by that, it means enable farmers to make efficient but also sustainable use of available water resources for crop production and rural livelihoods, and look at doing that whilst simultaneously avoiding negative externalities, so impacts on either environmental flow needs or on the needs of other water users, whether they be other farmers or urban users or industrial users of water. And we broadly work in two contexts. So on the one hand, some of our work is focused on what I would call kind of high productivity agricultural systems in places such as North America and Europe. In these areas, we're predominantly looking at regions where there are issues of over-abstraction of groundwater or of surface water, and we're looking at trying to help decision makers to design and target policies to mitigate those impacts whilst sustaining rural economies that depend on irrigated agriculture. But we also do a lot of work in smallholder farming contexts where water resources are often underutilized and farmers are highly exposed to risks posed by drought and climate variability and change. And in these contexts, we're looking at trying to understand what are the technologies, policies, and institutions that are needed to help those farmers to sustainably and cost-effectively intensify water use in order to meet goals such as improving food security, reducing rural poverty, and stimulating economic development. I'm going to talk mostly about the latter context and mostly in the context of Sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned. But I think one of the interesting dimensions for me about this audience is that many countries in Latin America, Mexico included, really have both of these kind of end member of agriculture and of problems around water management, both in terms of areas that are high productivity and perhaps have issues of over-abstraction, and areas that are lower in productivity and perhaps need to identify ways to increase and expand water use. So just to give a bit of background for the audience, some of you may be familiar with this already, others may be less so. So what's the sort of the need and the motivation for why we might want to try and develop and expand and intensify irrigation in Sub-Saharan Africa? Well, at the moment, Sub-Saharan Africa has, on a continental scale, one of the lowest rates of irrigation anywhere in the world. So as little as around 4 to 5% of land that is currently cultivated or under production in sub-Saharan Africa is actually actively irrigated year-round. And that has a number of negative implications, one of which is it means that crop yields are often significantly below potential. That has negative implications, not just for farmer incomes, but also for things such as food insecurity in the region. And the map on the left, which is from a study in PNAS by Jen Burney and others back in 2013, quite nicely illustrates this. The numbers are showing basically the percentage area of cropland equipped for irrigation. And the colors, in particularly the yellow, orange, and reds, are areas where you've got significant levels of serious or extremely serious levels of hunger and food insecurity. So you see a large proportion of sub-Saharan Africa is highly food insecure, and that tends to correlate with low levels of irrigation access and adoption. So broadly, what the goals of irrigation development are in sub-Saharan Africa are exactly the same as they are everywhere else in the world, whether that's in smallholder farming contexts or a developed agricultural context. We want to use irrigation to close yield gaps. So that's reducing, enabling farmers to increase yields by reducing negative impacts of rainfall variability and extremes. The other is that we want to increase cultivation intensity. Typically by that, we mean not just increasing the area under cultivation, but also increasing the number of crops that are grown each year. So cultivating in the dry season and not only in the rainy season. And obviously with climate change, increasing rainfall variability and production risks. The other goal of irrigation development is to enhance resilience to more frequent extremes of drought and rainfall variability that are becoming increasingly problematic, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, but globally. So if we think about that problem, about how, if we want to kind of answer the question of, well, how do we expand irrigation in sub-Saharan Africa? Well, historically, the way it's been done is broadly similar to what's shown in these two pictures here. These are both from an irrigation project called the Kano River Project in northern Nigeria. Sub-Saharan Africa, whilst it does have some renewable groundwater resources available, the aquifers are generally quite low productivity, and its main potential water resource source for irrigation is largely surface water based. There are a large number of major high volume flow rivers across the African continent. They're often transboundary river systems. And as a result, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century, there were large attempts, initially under colonial administrations and subsequently post-independence, by African governments to attempt to develop these river systems through construction of dams, canal systems, and a variety of other surface water infrastructure into large-scale irrigation projects and schemes such as the Kano River Project, the Office de Niger, also in West Africa, and other examples such as the Gezira scheme on the Nile River Basin that was tied up with some of the major dam constructions in that basin. Those kind of projects, for the most part, stopped being constructed in the latter half of the 20th century. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of which was that in the latter half of the 20th century, there was drops in global food prices that made those sort of large capital intensive infrastructure investments less desirable, and a lot of African countries instead focused on importing crops from other parts of the world where production levels were higher. Another reason was a lot of the projects were often tied up with things such as large-scale dam constructions in order to build the reservoirs necessary to serve the irrigation schemes, and they were increasingly criticized ultimately through the World Commission on Dams report in the early 2000s for their negative environmental and social impacts. And so large-scale irrigation really kind of went out of fashion and wasn't something that a lot of the big donor organizations like the World Bank were really committing much money for between the sort of 1980s and the early 2000s. In the last sort of 10 or 15 years or so, the big sort of large-scale irrigation projects have really kind of jumped right back onto the development agenda and are really kind of back in fashion, as the title of this slide says. I've just listed sort of 3 examples of a number of projects that are ongoing across the region at the moment. So the Palugu scheme in northern Nigeria, in northern Ghana, sorry, that proposes to construct a 24,000 hectare irrigation scheme. The figure on the right-hand side is a quote from the president of Ghana, showing that this is kind of a key part of national development strategies, particularly in the northern region of the country. The Kadaji scheme again in northern Nigeria, that's 122,000 hectare scheme, and the Shire Valley irrigation project, that's 43,000 hectare irrigation scheme in Malawi. These are just a handful of examples of projects that are either partially under construction or are in advanced planning stages across the continent and across the region. So work that we've been doing, and this is part of a large project funded through a program called the UK's Global Challenges Research Fund, which is designed to partner UK research organisations with overseas partners in low and middle income countries to conduct work around various aspects of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So our work on this project, which is called Future Dams, has basically been looking at the question, well, if large-scale irrigation is coming back into fashion, and we also see that we still have very low rates of irrigation development across the Sub-Saharan African region, are these actually the right kinds of investments to be making to improve agricultural water security in the region? And to try and answer that question, what we've been trying to do is look back and say, well, what can we say has been the performance of past large-scale irrigation investments in Sub-Saharan Africa? And then based on findings of that work, what we've been subsequently looking to do is to try and see, well, are there alternative ways of developing irrigation in the region? And are they likely to be any more or less beneficial for farmers in terms of crop productivity and income returns, and cost effective for governments and donors? And then broadly based on that, what should we be doing in terms of a set of policies and investments needed to support future sustainable intensification of irrigated agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa, and what lessons can that provide for other smallholder farming contexts around the world that are grappling with similar challenges, including in Latin America? So I'll take the first of these questions first, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about for this question and subsequent parts of the work is drawing on a paper that we published recently, earlier this year, 2 or 3 months ago now, in Nature Sustainability, where we looked to analyze the performance of around about 80 large-scale irrigation projects around different parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. One of these projects is the Bagre irrigation scheme in Burkina Faso in West Africa, which is shown in the image on the left-hand side. Here, the title and reference for the paper is here, and I'd be happy to kind of share a copy with anyone if you have any trouble accessing it. Please do drop me an email or get in touch via Agustin if you don't have my email. So how did we do this work? Well, we did 2 main things in our sort of approach to this study. So the first is that we spent quite a lot of time going through the records of a lot of planning documents for major irrigation projects across Sub-Saharan Africa. Because these tend to be big, large, capital intensive investments in the tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, these were typically financed at least partially by organizations such as the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and to a lesser extent in recent years, European investment banks. So what we looked to do is try to pull together planning documents for as many of the different schemes as we could find as possible. We ended up with 79, and from these planning documents to extract information about what the proposed agricultural production areas were when these schemes were planned and designed and financed. And an example is shown on the left-hand side for the Semri rice project in Cameroon in West Africa, and you can kind of see the key information in point B on the summary of the planning document, saying that this project was going to construct an irrigation network or scheme that was going to serve around 3,000 hectares of land, along with rehabilitating an existing 1,300 hectare irrigation project that already existed on this particular site. And we ended up with quite a nice distribution of projects that were scattered across the Sub-Saharan African region. So a lot obviously in West Africa and East Africa, aligning with the major large river basins in Africa, but also some in the sort of central and southern African belts, and also a few in Madagascar as well. So a decent geographic spread and distribution. What we then look to do is to use satellite remote sensing and land cover mapping to try and understand how much land is actually being cultivated and irrigated at present on each of these irrigation schemes. And this was broadly a kind of a two-step process. Unfortunately, the vast majority of these schemes we can't simply go onto a website at the World Bank and download the command areas and the boundaries of the schemes. So we had to use Google Earth and other high resolution overhead imagery to digitize the boundaries of the schemes based on the locations and the layouts of the canal networks. And we then use Landsat imagery and a supervised classification approach to determine which pixels within the boundary of the command area were being actively irrigated. And we classified as actively irrigated if a pixel was irrigated at least 3 times out of 5 years, where we took the sort of the present day period to be 2014 to 2018. I won't go into massive amounts of detail as to why we did that. The main reason, though, was to allow for the fact that some of these schemes have a rotation where parts of the land are fallowed for, say, 1 or 2 years out of every 5 or 10 years, in order to avoid reductions in things like soil fertility over time. So what we basically ended up with is then a data set for each of the schemes that told us what area the scheme proposed to deliver when it was planned and what area it's actively irrigating at the moment. And what we found, sort of going to go through basically the two kind of headline results from the paper here, and then discuss a little bit about what might be going on and what the implications are. So firstly, we found that on average, these schemes are delivering about 16% of the area that they proposed when they were originally planned and constructed and financed. There are also a very large number of schemes that are not delivering anything at all, so they're completely dormant and have, in most cases, completely collapsed and been abandoned. There are very few schemes that are delivering the proposed area, and there are occasional schemes that are delivering a little bit more than was originally planned. That's often where there has been a subsequent extension that wasn't adequately captured in the original planning documents. Somewhat concerningly, we also find that there's basically been no improvement in project performance over time. So what we have here is the sort of percentage area that's been delivered on the y-axis. We've got the sort of 100% line and dashed line there, and the year that the project was constructed. And our sample roughly spanned from the sort of the late 1940s all the way up till sort of just before 2010. So we have a approximately 60 to 70 year period where basically there's no trend in project performance over time. So if we look at schemes that were constructed relatively recently compared to ones that perhaps are very old, there's no real difference. They perform roughly similarly to one another. In general, scheme date of construction doesn't really seem to have much impact on performance, and that's significant because it suggests that we're not really getting any better at building and developing and implementing these projects over time, despite the vast amounts of money that have actually been being invested. So what we then tried to do is we wanted to try and understand what might be driving these factors. So we looked at conducting a range of statistical and machine learning based analysis to try and understand the drivers of scheme performance. Ultimately, what we found is that it's actually quite hard to explain why one scheme fails and another doesn't. And that's largely because some of the reasons are quite context specific. But in the process of going through and reviewing some of the historical reports and assessments of these different projects that are often conducted on a site-by-site basis, there are a number of key factors that were consistently flagged as being important reasons why many of these large-scale projects have really not achieved what they set out to achieve to begin with. One of the reasons for this is that there is a tendency in the planning and development of a lot of large-scale irrigation projects to systematically overstate what is actually achievable. And that is both in terms of the likely benefits or the likely area of cultivation that can actually be achieved, but also around the likely costs of implementing a scheme and the costs of constructing and maintaining it over time. And there's a number of reasons that underpin that. So firstly, there are big political incentives to overstate how much you can actually achieve when you're planning and proposing an irrigation project. Big donor organizations like the World Bank and the African Development Bank, their primary purpose is to move money from those organizations to countries in regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa to support development. And they like to move that money in large chunks. They don't like to deal with 500 different small irrigation projects. They prefer to invest in one single large-scale project that is easier for them to manage contractually. At the same time, for a lot of the governments in the region, irrigation development is often a political issue. And I've put this image again of the president of Ghana talking about the Palugu irrigation scheme, and you can kind of see some of the phrases that are being made in there about sort of this supporting a variety of government programs, so the One Village, One Dam and the Planting for Food and Jobs program. These are all big kind of headline policies, and one of the big reasons that the Palugu scheme is being constructed at this particular point in the location it's being constructed is that Ghana at this point was about to go through some major elections, and this was a key election pledge from the president to communities in the north of the country. So proposing to construct a big irrigation scheme that will serve a very large agricultural area, that will provide benefits to very large numbers of farmers, is in many ways in the interests of the people that are developing it, even if they know that it might actually not be practical to achieve in reality. And I think it's important to point out that this is not an issue that is unique to it's not an issue that's unique to Sub-Saharan Africa, and it's not an issue that's unique to irrigation projects. It's a problem that afflicts all infrastructure mega projects, whether they are in low and middle income countries or whether they are in high income countries. And I've put a couple of images on the right hand side of the slide to kind of that I'll use to sort of highlight this point. So one is of a hydropower project. So research 5 or 10 years ago now by a group at Oxford showed that many of the problems that we've found with irrigation projects are also common to large hydropower dams. Large hydropower dams were shown to basically, on average, underestimate costs of implementing those projects by about 100%. Similarly, the picture on the bottom right of the slide is from a project called Crossrail. So Crossrail is a large rail project that is designed to provide rapid transit from the west of London to the east of London, and then there's a separate branch of the project that is designed to provide rapid rail transit from the north of London to the south of London. That project is massively, massively over budget and is now somewhere around 10 plus years behind schedule. And we could go around pretty much every country, I think, in the world and find an example of these really big infrastructure projects that often never achieve what they originally set out to achieve, cost a huge amount more than was actually expected. And when you look back at it, you think, well, actually, this was quite predictable that this was going to happen. And this is partly just because big projects and big investments are very hard to manage and very hard to estimate what the likely benefits and costs are going to be. The other reason that a lot of large-scale irrigation projects are, or at least one of the reasons that we argue that they've largely failed to achieve their goals, is that there's also a big disconnect between the goals of the people that are planning and implementing and designing these schemes and the goals of the farmers and smallholder producers that are actually operating and trying to make a livelihood out of working within these schemes. Sometimes as growers within a larger sort of agricultural corporation, but often just as individual smallholder farmers that are allocated a portion of land. As I mentioned previously, a lot of the kind of the motivations for irrigation development have often centered around the goals of improving food security and reducing dependence on overseas markets. That's often meant that a lot of these projects have got developed sort of in the years after major food price spikes. And if we look at that sort of planning document header from the Senri Rice irrigation project that I showed on an earlier slide, you can see this sentence highlighted in the bottom, that production from the project would serve to reduce the national rice deficit and stimulate exports to nearby countries. So this is a really highlighting the goal of a lot of these projects. It's reducing food insecurity and enabling countries to be self-sufficient in key crops such as rice. And that's a great goal, but one of the problems is that crops such as rice and other cereal crops are often not particularly profitable or remunerative. They're very important in terms of national food security and internal food consumption, but you can't necessarily make a lot of money off them. And that becomes problematic when you have big irrigation projects that maybe have cost $100, $200, $300 million to construct, have very large amounts of infrastructure that have to be maintained. So if the farmers that are operating in those schemes can't make a lot of money off what they're being told to produce, they're unlikely to be able to contribute a lot back into the scheme in terms of water fees needed to maintain the operation and infrastructure of those schemes over time. So that raises big challenges for the financial sustainability of many of these schemes. And indeed, when you look at and go and talk to a lot of the managers of these projects, one of the things they highlight is that it's almost impossible to collect water fees or taxes from farmers, not because people don't want to pay, just because they simply aren't making enough money off the production that they make on the scheme to adequately contribute anything into it once they've satisfied their own basic livelihood needs. And what these two things kind of do together is that they create what often gets referred to as a cycle of build, neglect, rebuild. So a scheme gets built with ambitious plans and proposals. Those don't really get realized. The scheme suffers from issues of financial unsustainability. That leads to the infrastructure, so the canals, the dam walls, the extension services to help farmers becoming neglected and underfunded, and the scheme productivity in areas decline over time until a donor organization or a government comes in, pumps a bunch of additional money in there for a rehabilitation project, and that improves performance temporarily before you end up with the same problems occurring over and over again, largely because there's never actually an attempt made to address the root causes of project failure and unsustainability in this case. And this picture is from the Tono irrigation scheme in northern Ghana that we've done a bunch of field work around that I'm going to talk about in some of the subsequent slides. And this is a project to rehabilitate this scheme, and the project itself is going to cost about $90 million for the rehabilitation works. And that's despite the fact that this scheme has only ever achieved about 15 to 20% of the area that was originally proposed, and serves a significantly smaller number of farmers than was originally intended. So really there are sort of systematic problems in a way a lot of these projects are designed and implemented that really mean that they're unlikely on their own, at least, to be an effective tool for delivering wide-scale water security for farmers in sub-Saharan Africa. And these issues are not unique to sub-Saharan Africa. I know from talking to colleagues that they are an issue that are found across large-scale irrigation projects in Latin America, and we see the same issues cropping up with other work that we do in contexts such as South Asia and Southeast Asia. So a question therefore is there a better way of doing things? Obviously, there is a clear need to improve water security for farmers in sub-Saharan Africa, as there is in other regions, and doing so can have a really big positive impact on livelihoods and economic development, and also on things such as climate resilience. So is there a better way of doing things? Well, alongside these sort of large-scale irrigation projects that are found across sub-Saharan Africa, there's also there's an extensive and long-standing set of interventions, often referred to as farmer-led irrigation, so small-scale irrigation initiatives developed by farmers themselves that include things such as pumping from dry riverbeds, construction of small reservoirs, such as what's shown in the left and right images of this figure, respectively. What's not really known, though, is do these deliver any greater benefits for farmers than large-scale irrigation schemes, and what are the potential ways that we might combine different elements of these two approaches? So to try and answer this question, what we've been doing is we've been conducting some extensive field work in northern Ghana. This was selected as a case study for this work because it has a diversity of both large and small scale irrigation across the landscape. It's also a region that is heavily dependent on irrigation due to seasonal rainfall variability and water scarcity. So we've adopted a mixed methods approach using a combination of household and community surveys and focus group discussions with over 600 households across 37 villages in the region, covering, as I say, a mixture of large-scale government-managed irrigation scheme farmers, informal sort of small-scale irrigators that have invested in irrigation independently of government and donor support, and farmers that are rain-fed producers and don't have any access to irrigation at all. What we found is, so there's broadly two main crops that are cultivated here, so rice in the rainy season and pepper, and to a lesser extent other crops such as tomatoes in the dry season. And what we found is that in general, the scheme irrigators do better than the informal or the non-scheme irrigators, but both of them do a lot better than the rain-fed farmers or the non-irrigators. So we see that scheme irrigators have the highest rice yields and the highest pepper yields, and informal or farmer-led irrigators have higher yields than the non-irrigators, but not quite as high as those operating within the formal government schemes. Obviously, for pepper, what we find is because of the climatology of this particular region, the rain-fed farmers don't actually get any yield at all because they're unable to cultivate in the dry season because there's simply no rainfall at all, and it's just not possible to cultivate without access to irrigation. But a key kind of takeaway message from this is that you can a lot of these small-scale farmers are obtaining a significant chunk of the yield gains despite the fact that they're not really receiving any government support or infrastructure for irrigation. And if we look at what that translates to in terms of economic returns that farmers gain, this is revenue from crop sales, so basically any excess crop that's left over after having met the needs of household consumption. We see that, again, the farmers within the irrigation schemes that are managed by the government, again, have the highest returns. But there's also this big jump from being a rain-fed farmer to being one of these sort of informal farmer-led small-scale irrigators. And there's an important dimension that's going on underneath this figure is that what we find is that when we consider the actual costs of implementing the large schemes and the small schemes, we see that the actual kind of return on investment is much, much higher for these informal irrigators than for these small-scale farmers. So if you were a donor or you were a government and you wanted to look at how could I maximize the amount of increase in farmer income and food production for each dollar that I spend in a given region, you would be much better off spending that on these small-scale farmer-led irrigation initiatives than you would on big, large, centralized government-managed irrigation schemes. That largely suggests that this is a potentially promising solution, and it's one that is increasingly spreading across sub-Saharan Africa over recent years and decades. One of the caveats, however, with a number of these small-scale farmer-led irrigation initiatives, so one of the common approaches for farmers who wish to develop their own sources of irrigation in this region is to construct either small sand-dammed reservoirs or dugout reservoirs that store water during the rainy season and enable that water to be used in the subsequent dry season, and also to buffer against dry spells during the rainy season. One of the potential issues with these schemes is that because they are much smaller in scale, that also means that they have much lower levels of storage potential. What this figure is showing is for 5 years of data for the period November to April. So November is the start of the dry season in this region. April is roughly the end of the dry season and start of the next rainy season. And on the y-axis, what we have is the number of active small reservoirs. So an active small reservoir would be a small reservoir that we were able to identify from satellite mapping as having water stored within the reservoir that could be released downstream for use by farmers downstream of the small reservoir. And we see that what happens is, as we go through the season in each of these years, so as we go through the dry season, a number of these small reservoirs in this area actually completely dry up and are unable to supply water at all. And this is largely because these schemes are small in nature and scale, and therefore can easily be depleted and overexploited. And this does mean that they're potentially quite vulnerable to climate variability in a way that a large irrigation scheme with a big dam is perhaps less vulnerable, because it has much greater storage potential, can store a larger volume of water during the rainy season, and therefore is more effectively able to sustain a large number of irrigators over the subsequent dry season. And this is particularly significant in regions such as particularly sort of the West Africa and East African Sudano-Sahelian belt of Sub-Saharan Africa, because we are expecting that as climate change and global temperatures increase, that we are going to see greater variability and seasonality in rainfall in these particular regions, which is potentially going to increase the risks of seasonal water shortages that may affect farmers in these areas. These are just a couple of figures summarizing these kind of dynamics from a paper by Dunning et al. Based on some climate modeling work done by researchers at the UK Met Office. Again, this is not unique to Sub-Saharan Africa, and these kind of exacerbations of seasonal water scarcity are an issue facing a number of other areas around the world. So based on this, what do we think is the way forward for irrigation development in Sub-Saharan Africa? This is sort of research that is still ongoing at the moment and stuff that we're still actively working on. I think the first kind of take-home point that I'd like to make is that demand for irrigation infrastructure and projects is not going to go away in places like Sub-Saharan Africa. Levels of access to water are still very low. And as we saw on that previous slide, climate change is likely to increase water-related risks that farmers face. And it's also likely to increase the seasonal imbalances in water availability. What that means is that we are going to need to be building projects, whether they're large or small, or somewhere in between, that enables water to be stored in the rainy season so that it can be used to enable production year-round in the dry season. The question is just, how should we develop that, and what should those projects look like? And we argue that there's kind of two main things that need to be done to support this. The first is that we need to do a much better job at actually trying to monitor, audit, and learn from the performance of past investments. At the moment, there is basically no monitoring of active, already constructed irrigation projects, whether in Sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere in the world. So one of the things that we feel is needed is we need greater attempts, particularly by donors, but also supported by researchers, to enable continuous monitoring of project performance so that we can learn from past successes and failures, and also more effectively target interventions to ensure that schemes don't completely degrade and fall apart. And this is the figure on the left-hand side is showing an example from some work that we have ongoing in this area, which is using a combination of historical MODIS and Landsat imagery, along with newer Sentinel-2 and PlanetScope imagery as a way of developing decision support tools that allow government agencies and irrigation managers in given regions to conduct analyses of the activeness or the frequency of cropping in different areas of irrigation schemes, and also how the frequency of cropping is changing over time, so that we can monitor trajectories of performance of irrigation schemes over time and target interventions to try and rectify issues in schemes that are underperforming or in areas of schemes that are underperforming. We're also going to be trying to combine this with the earlier work to build up a database that goes beyond just Sub-Saharan Africa and looks at other regions to build up a more global scale picture of the performance of large scale irrigation projects and develop the tools to enable performance to be monitored continuously going forward into the future, leveraging new emerging satellite based data sets and technologies. And finally, the point I'd like to finish on would be that we need to think about how we combine the best of both large and small scale irrigation initiatives. Large scale irrigation is unlikely on its own to be a cost-effective means of scaling improvements in water access, but it does have a very positive feature in that in areas that do not have abundant groundwater resources, it can provide significant surface water storage that can be then used to support year-round irrigation. What probably needs to change is what happens downstream of the reservoir of the storage project or infrastructure itself. And in that regard, there needs to be more focus on irrigation schemes and planning of irrigation projects that emphasize the needs of farmers and that place the entrepreneurial, commercially oriented nature of farmer-led irrigation together with goals of increasing production of staple crops such as cereals to satisfy things such as national food security objectives, in order to ensure that these schemes can not only meet those goals, but also can be financially and technically sustainable over long time periods. And there are examples of where this has been done more successfully than others, particularly in a couple of the projects in East Africa, where there has been effective integration of more commercially oriented small-scale agriculture with some of these larger expanses of staple crop production. So I will finish on that. I'd just like to say, firstly, thank you for everyone to joining. I'm happy to take any questions that people have, and also some acknowledgements that this is work that has very much been a collaborative effort. So with those at Manchester within my group, Tom Higginbottom and Roshan Adhikari, who are postdocs working with us, and Sarah Rediker, one of our PhD students, and also one of our collaborators, Relitza Demova, who's a development economist within the Global Development Institute at Manchester. And particularly thanks to our partners in Ghana, so Waskal, Samuel Goog, and the International Water Management Institute, Sanders Vart, Benjamin Ganshar, and Konlavi Akpoti. A number of the figures and results that I've presented today are based on work that various members of this group have led as part of collaborative efforts, and this work wouldn't have been possible without their hard work and insight. So a thank you to them and an acknowledgement to them for their involvement in this work. So thank you, and happy to take any questions that are in the chat box or that people have.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Foster. Thank you very much, Tim, for this work, for your interesting seminar. I think we have a couple of questions. I will go with the first one from Carol Andrade. She's asking from which length of the canals it is considered large scale.
There's no formal definition, I guess, of what large scale is considered. We broadly looked at projects that have been, I guess, both externally financed, so ones that had been constructed with, say, donor support or central government financing. And we were looking at projects that were mostly sort of 500 hectares and above, anywhere up from about 500 hectares to about 500,000 hectares in terms of the planned irrigated areas. A lot of the sort of small scale farmer-led reservoir systems are more in the sort of 100 to 200 hectare type scale. So there wasn't kind of a clear kind of distinction between the two. It was largely governed by exactly how the projects were financed and supported, but typically, yeah, 500 to 1,000 hectares or more.
Okay. Yes, maybe perhaps also that can also depend on the size of the size of the irrigation project. I guess maybe, I don't know, from a few thousand hectares, that is like a threshold number for that.
Yeah, so we did, one of the things we ran in our analysis when we tried to sort of statistically analyze outcomes was the planned size of the scheme. And we found a significant, but only weakly significant relationship between scheme size and project outcomes, that generally the smaller schemes seem to do a bit better. That's broadly consistent with kind of anecdotal evidence from site-specific studies. We didn't quite have enough data points to enable us to really draw conclusive conclusions about that, but it's something that we're very keen to look into in the future, as if small schemes are potentially a better way of delivering irrigation access than large schemes.
Yeah, right. We have also from Eden Galindo a question about if you can briefly talk a little bit about the issue of monocultures in agriculture for small farmers, and if your work has considered non-GMO seeds.
We didn't look specifically at seeds, partly because of the scale of the analysis, although improved seed varieties are often one of the additional sort of interventions that go with the provision of say improved water access, and generally improved seeds do generally have a benefit in terms of raising yields, and that's obviously a positive thing. If you don't want to just increase cultivated areas, you also want to increase yields. There are obviously a variety of issues that go beyond this work in terms of sort of long-term access for farmers to improve seed varieties, depending on exactly how they are manufactured and contractually supplied to farmers. There are also an aspect that when the scheme falls into disrepair, sometimes the systems for farmers to continue to access improved seeds or improved fertilizers can often disappear with it, and you end up with farmers that have converted into a production system that all the support that they need to maintain that disappears when the scheme becomes no longer viable itself. So it can have sort of issues in terms of relationships with maintenance over time.
Yes. There's also one question from someone from IMTA who's asking how can you create or design and implement hybrid irrigation schemes, like that at the end you were talking about large scale and also small scale, specifically where the region is suffering from water scarcity?
I mean, I think there are some examples of it kind of happening effectively by chance. So a scheme falls into disrepair, and in some cases, there are examples of this in Tanzania of farmers effectively taking over the scheme that has been abandoned by the government and turning it into their own managed projects. I think one of the ways would be to look at examples where that has happened kind of organically on the ground and to try and learn what enabled that to happen. I think in some cases there also needs to be a recognition of farmers' ability to actually take on management and governance of a scheme at a government level. Governments often tend to a certain extent look down on small-scale farmers and assume that they're not going to know how to manage a project or how to manage irrigation. And often, if they're given a bit of the control and responsibility, they can actually deliver a lot of those functions effectively, particularly if the support is then targeted towards things like training and extension advice needed to help those farmers to effectively manage that irrigation scheme independently or semi-independently from government.
Yeah, right. And yes, we also have a question from Olga Cisneros, a researcher from IMTA, who's asking how to, I think this is a very important question, how do you manage to convince the governments to invest in small-scale irrigation projects rather than large-scale?
I think some of that comes from, I mean, a lot of these projects are not financed directly by governments. They're financed by large development agencies such as the World Bank or the African Development Bank. And to a certain extent, governments proposing large-scale irrigation projects are largely just following where the money is. I mean, I guess a bit like ourselves as researchers, we propose projects to try and fit the funding calls that are put out there by our funding agencies, even though we might in some cases want to work on a slightly different problem or question if we were to be given complete freedom. So to a certain extent, the projects that are proposed follow where the money is made available. And if donor organizations place greater emphasis on supporting small-scale initiatives, and this is something that they're often not very willing to do because there's a bureaucratic hassle of trying to deal with 500 individual small projects as opposed to one big project where they just talk to the Minister of Water or the Minister of Agriculture. If they shift that focus, a lot of governments will shift with it because a lot of governments know that these small-scale systems are a better way of delivering on the things that they're trying to achieve, but they need the financing to enable them to do that. So I think it's partly about aligning financing. It's also partly about developing effective approaches for auditing and tracking performance. Once it becomes clear that there's an evidence base that small-scale projects work better, it becomes harder to argue for the big project where you say, I'm going to deliver 30,000 hectares, if there's an evidence base that says that's never actually been achieved in practice.
Hello, I'm afraid Dr. Brenner had to leave to join another meeting, but Dr. First, I introduce myself. I'm a project leader of hydrometeorology here at the Mexican Institute of Water Technology. So if you don't mind, I'll follow up with the questions. Quite an interesting presentation, by the way. So I'm moving on to a question by Dr. Antonio Quevedo, and he says, thank you, Dr. Foster, for the interesting presentation. From your point of view, what role do technological developments play in small-scale irrigation schemes?
I think technology, I guess I'm going to interpret what I think you mean by technological developments, and you can maybe jump in with a follow-up question if I've misinterpreted. I mean, I think technological developments, which if you think about, say, new irrigation application approaches or pumping technologies, those kind of things, they're very useful and they're an important part of the mix in terms of enabling farmers to use water efficiently. I think one of the experiences from this work and also from work in other contexts such as South Asia is that often there are a lot of gains that can be made from quite low tech approaches as well. A lot of farmers actually lack any direct information about how much water they should be applying to their crops, when they should be applying it, if they've only got so much, how they should decide when to allocate and apply that water. And actually even just provision of relatively simple information like that doesn't necessarily require any sort of new technologies that might have a learning curve, that might have a high capital cost associated with them, can often be a way of generating some quite big improvements in productivity. And sometimes sort of simple approaches that start from the perspective of what are the things that people are finding hard to do at the moment can be more effective initially than trying to say, introduce a new technology that farmers may be unfamiliar with and may find difficult adapting to their local operating conditions. Solar irrigation pumps, I think, are a nice example of this in groundwater irrigation areas. In the longer term, I think they're a great technology and have a lot of potential, but they still have a very high capital cost. They are quite inflexible in terms of how much they can be moved around the landscape. And often they might not necessarily be exactly the first thing that we should be trying to do.
Thank you very much, Dr. Forster. That's quite an interesting thing to note about the learning curve. I have another question, and I'll wait if there are other incoming questions. Regarding efficiency in water management, can we compare the efficiency of small and big systems, and which factors should we take into account?
I think that's a really good question. And one of the things that we're kind of conscious of is that particularly in the first bit of work that we presented, we really just looked at one aspect of performance and efficiency. So we looked at basically area delivered over area planned, but there are other factors that are obviously important, and we might care about, say, things like water productivity. So how much water is actually being taken out of the river system that is being linked to a particular project, and how much yield of crop is being produced. I think also in terms of a lot of these projects, we should also be thinking about kind of economic efficiency and cost effectiveness. Ultimately, these projects require money to build, and they require money to keep them running and operational, as do all of the small scale farmer-led investments. Farmers don't tend to invest in stuff that doesn't make them money and that makes them poorer. They tend to invest in things that are profitable and remunerative, sometimes perhaps slower than we would like because of the risks associated with certain investments. But really, I think we need to be looking at sort of what are the returns on investments and what is the best way of increasing farmer incomes whilst ensuring that we're also obviously adopting strategies that are hydrologically efficient and sustainable. So I think there's research gaps in both areas, and that we don't really know a lot about the cost effectiveness of different approaches, but we also don't really know what the kind of hydrological implications are of having one big dam versus 500 small dams.
Yeah, of course, makes sense. I'm glad that you highlighted the importance of closing this research gap. I believe there are no other questions, so if you don't mind, I'm going to just make a brief closure, and then I'll ask for your closure as well, because you would like to hear your final words on this very interesting topic. So for our audience, the webinar by Dr. Timothy Foster provided evidence about the reasons of why large-scale irrigations have failed in Sub-Saharan Africa. The presentation clearly displayed the regional food security policy does not always align with profitable agriculture, lack of infrastructure maintenance, among other factors. He then explored the suitability of decentralized schemes in small irrigation to enhance food and water security, and the results clearly provide a lot of evidence to increase crop productivity, though lower economic returns, but on the other side, much smaller investment costs. However, it is important to point out that this type of irrigation schemes are jeopardized by currents and possibly future climate variability. The conclusions of his work indicate that successful irrigation agriculture is likely to follow a hybrid scheme, which means large, small water storage schemes, and that transparency in the performance in past and current large-scale irrigation projects is very much needed. So please, Dr. Foster, you would like to just close your presentation with a few words. And thank you very much for taking the invitation. It was very, very constructive, productive to have you and to know more about your research.
Thank you, Iska. I mean, I think that's a very nice summary of kind of what I would say are sort of the main messages really of the work. I mean, I guess an additional point to highlight would be we've obviously sort of focused very much today on Sub-Saharan Africa, but small and large scale irrigation development's obviously a big issue in Mexico and in much of Latin America as well. One of the things I highlighted is that we're keen to look at scaling up both some of the monitoring approaches that we've developed, but also to look at to what extent some of these sort of lessons and dynamics can also be explored in other contexts around the world. So if there are people who've joined today and have listened and are working in this area and would like to have discussions about that, I'd be very, very happy to do so after the webinar. I think my email should be on there or can be circulated. So yeah, I think just to close, I mean, thank you to Agustin and Marco and the rest of the team for the invitation and the opportunity to present in your webinar series. And thank you for all the interesting questions that highlighted a lot of really useful points and have given me things to think about and go away and think about for future work on this topic.
Really glad to hear that, Dr. Foster. And then over to Marco Sanchez, just to make the final closure of the webinar, please.
Muchísimas gracias, Iskra. Thank you very much, Tim Foster. It was really nice having you today with us. And you have now some more friends from Mexico and Latin America and followers, of course. And I want to thank Pamela Iskra Mejía. Ella es subcoordinadora de hidrometeorología en el IMTA, que nos hizo también pues, el favor de acompañarnos en este cierre, con un cierre pues, muy preciso de la charla de Tim Foster. And we hope to have you very soon again with us. Now I want you to invite you to stay with us because we are going to share some further invitations. At the finish of this seminar, we're going to take a picture of all of us we shared in this seminar. So quisiera invitar a todas nuestras amigas y amigos que nos acompañaron en esta magnífica sesión de abrir también nuestra visión a otras formas de conocer aproximaciones técnicas, aproximaciones científicas también al análisis de los sistemas de irrigación de gran escala en otros países del mundo y por supuesto que nos lleva también a reflexionar a la realidad que experimentamos en nuestros propios países y poder tener más elementos de contraste gracias a la presentación de Tim Foster esta mañana. Yo quiero invitarles a que, como todos los eventos, quienes estén de acuerdo de hacerlo, puedan encender sus cámaras y podamos prepararnos para tomar una imagen de todo el grupo que tuvimos la oportunidad de compartir este espacio de conocimiento de viernes 7 de mayo de 2021. Y en lo que encendemos nuestras cámaras, quienes así lo deseen, yo quisiera compartir con ustedes rápidamente algunas invitaciones, si están de acuerdo, para que podamos seguir conectados en estos espacios y actividades de conocimiento que comparte el Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua y la Cátedra UNESCO IMTA para todas y todos nosotros. La próxima semana, en 7 días, el 14 de mayo, una presentación de nuestro colega en el Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua, Rodrigo Santos Telles, con un sistema de monitoreo de parámetros hidráulicos y de calidad del agua de bajo costo y fácil acceso, tecnologías apropiadas para países como México y como pues amplias regiones en nuestro planeta que pueden aprovechar estas tecnologías, ya están en marcha y él nos compartirá la experiencia tanto de nos comentan ahora que hay algunas dificultades para abrir las cámaras. Ahorita ya estamos al pendiente de poder solucionar ese tema técnico. Muchísimas gracias por avisarnos. Ahorita lo solucionamos en un instante. Entonces, esta invitación, Rodrigo Santos, ya está abierto el registro para este evento que será dentro de 7 días. El registro está abierto en la página de la Cátedra UNESCO. Por favor, acompáñenos. La que sigue, por favor. Cursos, tenemos también desarrollo profesional e institucional, es una de las líneas de acción también importantes del instituto para todos los interesados en la temática del agua. Del 11 al 14 de mayo, la próxima semana, un curso en línea, Marco Legal de Aguas Nacionales y los arreglos institucionales asociados, con Roberto Galván Benítez. El registro está ya abierto, un curso con duración de 16 horas, toda la información en la página de educación del Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua y tenemos también el correo electrónico en pantalla para que lo podamos compartir. Nos piden también compartir los links para el registro, pues pueden registrarse, ya lo estamos viendo aquí, en los diferentes espacios donde estamos compartiendo ya en el chat de Zoom. Y lo estaremos compartiendo también, por supuesto, en redes sociales. La que sigue, por favor. Del 17 al 21 de mayo, para aquellos que estén interesados en certificar sus competencias profesionales en torno a la impartición de cursos. Aquí hay muchísimas personas que tienen una actividad importante, fundamental, compartiendo sus conocimientos. Hay una preparación para la impartición de cursos de formación de capital humano de manera presencial en grupos. Es un estándar de competencia para el cual el IMTA está habilitado para hacer la capacitación y, por supuesto, posteriormente también para hacer la certificación. Del 17 al 21 de mayo, este curso está ya también abierto y disponible para todas y todos ustedes, los interesados, o si saben de alguien que esté interesado, pues muchísimas gracias por correr la voz. Están los datos de contacto también de la página de educación del Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua y un correo electrónico para más detalles. La que sigue, por favor. Recordarles que pues ya en unos días más, en una semana más, se cierra la convocatoria para uno de los programas de posgrado del instituto, la maestría en gestión integrada de los recursos hídricos en modalidad a distancia. El 15 de mayo cerramos ya esta convocatoria que pues esperamos todavía algunos aspirantes más que se puedan sumar a esta convocatoria. El calendario ya está publicado, todos los requisitos están también en la página del Instituto Mexicano de Tecnología del Agua y toda la información en la página del posgrado que tenemos también en pantalla. La que sigue, por favor. Los invitamos muchísimo, de verdad que estamos muy entusiasmados. Ayer publicamos el segundo número de nuestro boletín, del newsletter del IMTA, en redes sociales, Hidrófilos, y está disponible aquí la liga también para que te puedas suscribir, o simplemente, o más fácil, puedes ingresar a cualquiera de las redes sociales del instituto, en Twitter, en Facebook, y ahí puedes encontrar el segundo número del boletín, que es el que está publicado desde ayer, y ahí mismo puedes hacer tu suscripción con temas de lo más interesante y también para compartir con personas no especializadas en muchos temas del agua, pero interesados en la temática hídrica. Este es un espacio importante para seguirte vinculando con los temas fundamentales del agua. La que sigue, por favor. Perspectivas, les invitamos muchísimo a que nos lean. Todos los lunes publicamos en la página del instituto y también en otros medios, pues textos de análisis de los temas fundamentales de la gestión del agua en nuestro país. Esta semana la perspectiva sobre la sequía actual en México que estamos experimentando y pues es un fenómeno natural que forma parte de la variabilidad del clima y que tiene impactos y que tiene efectos en muchas de las esferas de nuestras vidas cotidianas. Los invitamos a que nos lean en la página y a que nos comenten y por supuesto a que nos propongan otras temáticas que sean de su interés. La que sigue, por favor. Y bueno, recordarles nuestras redes sociales para que mantengámonos conectados a partir de ahora y de manera permanente en esta comunidad de conocimiento que abrimos, por supuesto, en estos espacios. Y creo que esta fue la última imagen. Y ya estamos listos ahora sí para poder activar nuestras cámaras. Ya solucionamos el tema de técnico para que podamos compartirlo. Y pues, ¿qué les parece si a la cuenta de 3 nos regalamos una gran sonrisa de viernes? Una gran sonrisa de que ya empieza el fin de semana y de que estuvimos juntos y que pudimos compartir este espacio de conocimiento y de reflexión con todas y con todos ustedes. A la cuenta de 3, si les parece. 1, 2 y 3. Y vamos a contar hasta 3 también, y también festejando y comentando que los procesos de vacunación continúan en pues, diferentes países del mundo. En México está continuando, en la región donde vivimos estamos muy contentos también porque, por ejemplo, en el estado de Morelos y en otros estados del país está ya atendiéndose a la población, a la comunidad académica y a la comunidad educativa para poder continuar con la normalidad de estas actividades. Así lo estamos haciendo también en el posgrado y en todo el personal académico del instituto para poder estar mucho más cerca de ustedes y poder estar pronto juntos de manera presencial y recobrar paulatinamente esta normalidad. Ojalá que este proceso pues pueda continuar con la celeridad que tenemos ahora y que pronto estemos juntos de nuevo, pues continuando con estas actividades de conocimiento, por supuesto, en línea, pero también de manera presencial muy pronto. Entonces, a la cuenta de 3, nos regalamos otra gran sonrisa y no nos queda más que desearles el mejor de los fines de semana. Thank you very much again, Tim. We'll hope you see you soon again.
Thank you, Marco, and everyone.
See you. Buenas tardes en Mánchester.
Yeah, buenas tardes.
Hasta luego.